Okay, this presentation is on the skin, or our integumentary system. And information on the skin is found in your textbook in Chapter 7, pages 94 to 109. Our skin is the largest organ in our body. It makes up about 15% of our total body weight, or there's about 2 square yards of skin in an average adult. Despite being the largest organ in our body, it's as thin as a paper towel, so it's about 5 millimeters. I wish all my clothes were like the skin. Lightweight, very, very thin, self-repairing, and waterproof. Our skin has a number of very important functions. Number one, protects our fragile underlying tissues. It protects them from physical damage, from chemical damage, from UV radiation, from hot, cold, and from invasion of all sorts of microorganisms. It prevents our body from losing water. It helps regulate our body temperature. It contains sensation receptors, so touch, temperature, pain receptors. It makes some vitamin D for us, and as a bonus, it gets rid of some small amounts of urea and uric acid, which are waste products. I would like you to read the beginning of Chapter 7 on some of those important functions of the skin. Our skin is made up of 2 layers. The outer layer of the skin is the epidermis, and that is epithelial tissue. And the lower layer of the skin is the dermis, and that's made up of very dense connective tissue. Below the skin, so under here, there's a third layer, which is mostly fat tissue, and this is called the hypodermis, or subcutaneous tissue. Technically, it's not part of the skin. Hypo meaning below, dermis, so below the dermis. And that's mostly fat tissue. It pads, it insulates us, and it anchors the skin to the underlying muscle. Okay, if we look at the outer layer of our skin, the epidermis, the very top 20 to 30 layers are dead skin cells. And in the picture on the left, you see the green stuff is the dermis, and all of this brown stuff is the epidermis. And you can see this kind of flaky outer layers. Those are about 20 to 30 layers of dead cells. And those cells contain a very tough water-repellent protein called keratin. This is the same tough protein that is in our nails, that makes our nails really hard, and is in our hair as well. And because it's so tough, that's what it really protects our body from physical, chemical, bacterial, other microorganisms. And because it's water repellent, that's what prevents us from, evaporating, losing body water. We shed this outer layer continuously, so we shed about 9 pounds of skin every year. And the entire epidermis, including the outer layers and then the underliving layer of cells, the whole epidermis will replace itself about every 35 to 45 days. So if we look on the right-hand picture, you can see the outer layers of dead skin cells, and then you can see underneath there are a layer of living cells that actually get a blood supply. And so these cells divide, and as they divide, they get pushed towards the surface away from the blood supply, and that means that they start to die, and as they die, they then fill with this keratin, and they get really tough and flat as they move towards the surface. But the bottom layers are living cells, and they do divide. If you look in this bottom layer, you can see some cells that contain a pigment. That pigment is called melanin, and it's produced by a scattering of specialized cells in this layer called melanocytes. Now, melanin then is secreted by these melanocytes, and it's eaten up by other cells in this layer, and then of course these cells get pushed towards the surface. And that's what determines our skin color, is how many melanocytes we have and how much melanin that they are producing. So melanin production can be affected by a number of things, but one of them is UV radiation. So when we are outside in the sun, our melanocytes, however many we have to begin with, will start producing more melanin. The reason they do this is that melanin has a protective function. It acts like a little umbrella that sits over top of the DNA in these skin cells, and that protects the DNA from being mutated by UV rays. So the more melanin that you produce, then the more protected your skin cells are, and that's why people with fairer skin are more vulnerable to skin cancers, to DNA mutations in their skin. There are other things that can affect melanin production, including things like radiation, heat, some chemicals, drugs, hormones, and some diseases that will either cause melanocytes to produce less melanin, so you get a lighter area of skin, or more, so you get a darkened area of skin. That's what produces, freckles as well, or moles, which are, highly concentrated areas of these melanocytes. Below the epidermis is the dermis, and in this diagram you can see the epidermis at the top, and then this layer of dense connective tissue that is filled with all sorts of important structures. And then at the bottom here in this picture you can see adipose or fat tissue. That's the hypodermis, or the subcutaneous tissue. So lots of important structures in the dermis. For one, we have receptors for sensation. So this little bulby looking thing here is a touch receptor. The naked nerve endings, the things that have no specialized structure, those are for pain and temperature. We also have blood vessels that run through this area. They provide nutrients and take away wastes from all of these living cells, but they also play a really important role in temperature regulation. So when we get really hot, these blood vessels all dilate, get larger, it brings more blood to the surface of our skin where there's a big surface area, and we can get rid of heat that way. And conversely, when we're really cold, all of these blood vessels will constrict, and that shunts the blood towards our core to reserve heat at our important organs. We also have a number of or all sorts of collagen elastic fibers that run through this area, and these hold on to moisture, so that keeps our skin hydrated. It also gives our skin it's some toughness and elasticity. Unfortunately, as we get older, collagen and elastic fibers start to degenerate, and so our skin gets more saggy and we get wrinkles, and it also becomes quite a lot drier. This is a sweat gland, and you can see the duct that then runs towards the surface. Sweat glands produce sweat, which is a combination of water, salt, urea, uric acid, and interestingly enough, vitamin C. And this fluid gets then moved up the duct and released on the surface, and there it evaporates, and that has a cooling effect. Sweat is acidic. We talked about this before, so that helps decrease the growth of bacteria on the surface of our skin. Most sweat around our body is odorless, but the sweat from glands in our armpits and in the genital area also contain, in addition to water, salt, urea, uric acid, and vitamin C, contain a protein and contains protein and fats. And so bacteria like to hang out here, and they use this protein and fats as nutrients, and the byproduct of using these nutrients produces an odor, and so that's why we have body odor in armpit and genital areas. We also have hair follicles, and you can see this is a hair follicle, and there's the shaft with the hair growing up from the follicle. And attached to the hair follicles are sebaceous or oil glands, and you can see them here. They produce sebum, and sebum is a combination of oil plus fragmented cells, and it gets secreted into the hair shaft, and then it moves up the hair shaft to the surface of the skin, and it lubricates the skin, and also contains a substance that kills bacteria as well. I'd also like to just point out, attached to the hair follicle is a little tiny muscle called the Erector Pili muscle. And when this muscle contracts, it causes the hair to stand on end, and we get this little bump, and so that's what we call goosebumps. So when we are afraid or when we're cold, it stimulates this little muscle to contract, and all our hair stands on end, and we get that little goosebumps. When our hair stands on end, just by the way, air gets trapped underneath, and it's like having a down coat on top of your skin. It holds in that air, and it helps insulate your body. So that's why we get goosebumps when we're cold. This is a couple of pictures of this hair follicles and sebaceous glands under magnification. So here on the left-hand side, you can see this is the sebaceous gland, and it secretes its sebum right into that shaft of the hair follicle. And on the right, this is a slightly lower magnification, so you can see there's the sebaceous gland, that yellow arrow, and the red arrow is the hair that's growing up that shaft. Now what you can see is that sometimes if sebum gets released and it clogs that hair follicle shaft, then the sebum can start to build up in that area, and bacteria can grow in that area, and then that can cause an ingrown hair, or also what we call as a pimple. So acne is actually a metabolic disorder. It's caused by sebaceous glands that are overactive. They produce a ton of sebum, and as a result it blocks that hair follicle, and it becomes trapped, and then bacteria can start to grow in there, and then we get this little bump. When we get a whitehead, it means that that trapped sebum is not exposed to the surface, so there's a layer of of tissue over top of that. When we see a blackhead, which is what you see in this picture here, it means that that sebum is exposed to the surface, it becomes oxidized, and it turns black. If we get a large infection in that area, then we call that inflammatory acne, and it becomes very red, and it's an active bacterial infection. So we're going to talk about what drugs are best in terms of treating pimples and inflammatory acne, but because it's largely a bacterial type of infection, then substances that contain an antibiotic are very effective. The other thing, there are some drying agents that can also be effective, and it's some sort of exfoliating. So there's two sort of principles. One is treat the bacteria, two is treat and try to get the hair follicles open. We're going to talk about a number of disorders of skin. We won't get to all of them by any means, but disorders of the skin can fall into a variety of categories. So there could be skin reactions that are related to immune system issues, so things like allergies, eczema, that all falls into that category. Of course, infections, so viral, bacterial, fungal infections, parasites. Skin can be injured with things like cuts, wounds, burns. We can have tumors, so skin cancers, and then there's a whole raft of disorders of the skin that are classified as idiopathic, meaning that we actually don't know. So we can't possibly in this time cover all of the disorders of skin. I'm going to focus on things that I believe are common and things that you're likely to run into in the field. And we'll do that in part 2.